Well, let's go ahead and get started, Laura, okay?
Okay, well, thank you once again for doing this, John. This is our biannual fall history book discussion. And we're thinking of, John was hoping to do John Lewis's biography by Meacham, but it's so new that there were not too many copies in the system yet, and there were a lot of holds. So I'm hoping he'll do that next season. And meanwhile, I suggested this book by Bryan Stevenson, Just Mercy. I hadn't read it at the time, but I was fortunate enough to see Bryan Stevenson himself at a Public Library Association conference many years ago. And he has a very powerful TED Talk. And it just stuck with me that it would be something that would be pertinent to today. So besides carrying on this discussion, I quickly want to point out a new book that just came in, which is do you all see that?
Yeah,
it's really a remarkable book because it documents all sorts of cases that deal with this same sort of subject, and has a lot of pictures of the locations and all of the different civil rights incidents. It's part of the Civil Rights Memorial. So that's basically what I have to say. John, do you want to take it away?
Mm-hmm. I'm glad. It's so nice to have you here. And Steve, we're very fortunate. We have Steve Johnson, an attorney who's done a lot of criminal defense work. So your insights are going to be very interesting, Steve, in this discussion. Yeah. Let me just hit you with a few numbers just to set the context for our discussion of the book. Of course, we're doing Bryan Stevenson's, excuse me, Just Mercy. But the book I found to be one that really upset me, but at the same time gave me hope. So there's like conflicting emotions there. But here's some statistics. USA, highest rate of incarceration in the world, right as we speak. Now, these numbers I'm giving you are Bryan's numbers from 2014, the copyright. 2.3 million incarcerated at that time, compared to 300,000 in the early 70s. Nearly 6 million people on probation and parole. 1 in every 15 people born at the beginning of this decade is expected to do either jail time or prison time. If you're a Black baby born in this decade, you have and you're male, you have a 1 in 3 chance of being incarcerated. Until 2005, we were the only country in the world that condemned juveniles to death. Supreme Court in 05 overruled that. Until 2012, we were the only country in the world that condemned children, juveniles, to life imprisonment without parole. But Supreme Court entered into that. A few words about Bryan Stevenson, and then a few words about the book, and then we'll get our discussion going. To say Bryan Stevenson is an inspiration is an understatement. It's truly an understatement. We have a man here who was born Black, poor, grew up in Delaware. His great-great-grandparents were slaves in Virginia. His grandfather was knifed to death when Bryan was in Philly, when Bryan was a teenager. His lifelong crusade as an attorney has been to help the marginalized, to help the wrongly convicted and incarcerated poor people, young people, Black people, mentally challenged people, to help them either get their sentences reduced or overturned. In 2018, Bryan Stevenson received the Benjamin Franklin Award from the American Philosophical Society. This is their most prestigious award. And the American Philosophical Society has been around since days of Thomas Jefferson. He was, I believe, the first president of the society. This year, he received the Right Lively Award, which is widely known as the Alternative Nobel Prize. The book itself has just a partial list. In 2014, it was selected to be one of Time Magazine's one of 10 best nonfiction books. In 2014, the New York Times called it one of the 100 notable books published that year. In 2015, the book won the Andrew Carnegie Mellon Award for Excellence in Nonfiction, and the list goes on. In 2019, the book was made into a movie, and with Jamie Foxx and Michael B. Jordan. It's really a very well done movie. Follows closely to the book, and I highly recommend it. Just a quick synopsis of the book for those who haven't read it. The story, 70% of the book revolves around the conviction of a person called Walter McMillan, a 45-year-old
Okay, got it.
living in Monroeville, Alabama. And that, hello, Sandy, welcome, Sandy. And Monroeville, ironically, is the home of Harper Lee, who wrote the book that came with the movie that Gregory Peck starred.
To Kill a Mockingbird.
Kill a Mockingbird, yes. So that's the irony. And the town to this day is still very proud of that connection. So we're focusing, right now I'm focusing on Walter McMillan, nicknamed Johnny D, 45 years old. He has 9 kids. And there's a murder in town. An 18-year-old woman, white woman. Laura, could you, Rhonda Morrison, could you flash her picture up there, please?
Okay, hold on a minute. And now, of course, I changed the scene. There we are. So this is Rhonda.
Yeah, she's at a dry cleaner laundromat. And at November 1st, 1986, she is shot in the back.
833079.
I'm sorry?
I think that was a mistake.
Oh, okay. Anyways, so she's killed in the laundromat. For 6 months, the crime is unsolved in this small town. However, there is pressure being placed on the sheriff, guy called Tate, who incidentally just retired last year, and on the DA to find and prosecute the killer of Rhonda Morrison. So the pressure is building. Well, Walter, at the time, with his married 9 kids, is having an affair with a married white woman. And the town knows about it. So here is an opportunity to solve this crime. They go after Walter. Now, he is arrested. And Steve, help me out here, but this sounds pretty rare. Instead of being placed in jail, he is immediately placed on death row.
Not in Wisconsin.
In Alabama.
And it's highly unusual, except
in federal court, they give you a probation officer immediately when you're charged, I guess. So federal court criminal is a little different, but this is state court.
Okay, well.
That would be highly unusual, but
Highly
it's
unusual. He's placed on death row. You can take those pictures down,
Okay.
Laura, if you'd like.
that's highly
actually at his
prejudicial,
release.
right?
Well, eventually he comes to trial. Day and a half trial. The jury is composed of 11 white people, 1 black person. And in that trial, he is convicted and sentenced to death. But here is the catch. Here's the catch. And at the time of the murder, Walter, or Johnny D, I'll call him, is at a fish fry with over a dozen people at the exact time of that murder. So he has all these eyewitnesses saying that alibi, saying he is there. One of those is a police officer. Secondly, there is a fella called Hook, who's a jailhouse snitch. And he testifies against Walter. And in his testimony, he says that he saw Walter's truck leaving that laundromat where Rhonda was killed right at that time. And he called it a lowrider truck, chopped down truck. He said he saw it. Well, here's the catch. At that exact day, Walter's truck has no transmission in it because it's getting repaired. Also, the chopped down or low slung truck that Hook says he sees doesn't really, the mechanic says later on, he didn't do that work until half a year after the murder. Then there's another person called Myers, key witness. Oh, before I go further, Hook was after he testified, immediately released from jail, and he was paid $5,000 for that testimony. $5,000 to testify. Myers tells a story that Johnny D on that day has a hurt arm, so couldn't drive. So he asked Myers to drive him to the laundromat. And Myers says he's not in the laundromat, but he hears the shots go off, and Walter comes out and they drive away. Well, as we'll talk more about it, the testimony is totally fabricated because Myers is trying to get off death row. And this is his way of doing it. So what the book does with Bryan telling the story, Bryan steps in about a year after Walter is convicted. And it's his quest to get him released. And it takes 5 more years to do so. That's 70% of the book. The other 30% of the book looks at and talks about cases that Bryan was involved in with 13, 14-year-olds, mentally challenged people, poor people, Black people who were either wrongly convicted or penalty was much greater than the crime. So that's a quick summary of the book. So let's go ahead and start talking about it. For those who read it, I had a very visceral reaction to this book. And I kept thinking to myself, I've always seen those scales of justice, blind, balanced. And those scales all of a sudden didn't look very real to me. I kept saying, this is not 1956. This is not 1976. This is 1986. How could that be happening? That wasn't very long ago. How could this happen? There's stories in the book of people who and we still hear them today, wrongly convicted in prison for 38, 40 years. And it just seems a very visceral response.
The thing that really horrified me was that 14-year-old boy who was electrocuted. And then apparently the Alabama came out and said he was wrongfully killed. So just imagine that, a 14-year-old boy, just for no reason.
When Johnny D. Walter McMillan was released, and we're going could you show that photo?
Which one was that?
The one with Walter and Bryan outside the courtyard, it looks like.
Whoops, hold on a minute. I'm not smooth at this, sorry. I'll get it. So here's a website that has a number of pictures.
There he is. There is Walter on the left, his hand up in the air. And that's his wife in the middle. And on the right is a young Bryan Stevenson. Mm-hmm. What he is saying here is, he says, I feel like a bird. I feel like a bird being released. But let me add to that. These are Johnny D's words. I experienced the executions, because he's on death row, with the greatest pain and with enormous fear about whether this would happen to me. While he was on death row, 7 people down, up and down the row were put in the electric chair and killed. From my cell, you could smell the stench of burning flesh. The smell of someone you know. Burning to death is the most painful and nauseating experience on this earth. And when I read that, and I kept thinking, how do you handle that psychologically? How do you, I would think there would be tremendous PTSD after he got out. Oh, by the way, when he did get out, he went back to logging. That was his job. Unfortunately, about 1.5 years after his logging, a limb fell on him, broke his neck. And that was the end of his logging career. And then he became running sort of a junkyard. And unfortunately, in 2013, he died of dementia. But anyway, there's his day of release.
That's what I was wondering, is what happened to the man after that experience. And I guess I would wonder how much of that experience had to do with the dementia that he did have. It's just a question in my own mind.
I think that experience one of the things I read, Louis, is that experience. I don't know if it's how true it is someone's assessment. That experience in prison, being wrongfully charged and convicted, placed on death row, somehow added to the higher probability of dementia. I don't quite see the scientific connection there, but it's something to think about. That's for sure.
Well, one thing that I read is none of the people Bryan Stevenson mentions in the book were perfect to start with, or most of them were not. In fact, Walter was a drug dealer, marijuana and things like that, but he didn't deserve what he got. And so that's what's so amazing about this book is Bryan Stevenson he doesn't see people as perfect. He's not helping people who are perfect. It's a human world and he wants justice. Just mercy, something that's balanced, not just condemning people to death because someone else uses them as a scapegoat. So go on. No.
Finish yours.
No, I just like that fact that it's not black and white.
Well, I was going to say that, isn't that what a lot of people said about George Floyd? He was a criminal. So why the big hub to do? And it's all about no one person should be the judge, jury, and executioner of anybody, I think that's why there's such an uprising in our country.
And
Laura, could you take the picture down so I can see
Sure.
everyone again? Thank
And
you.
that's what's so amazing about it also is even though we know things happened, pre-Civil War, Civil War, after the Civil War, and then this book is the 80s and things are still going on today in the same, that many of us just can't understand.
Yeah. Let me say a few words more about Bryan Stevenson. So he ended up going to a undergraduate Christian college in Pennsylvania. I think it was called Eastern. And then from there, he went to Harvard and got a JD degree. While he was at Harvard, he did an internship down in the South, working with people who have been placed on death row. And from that point on, actually from that internship, he knew what his life calling was. When he graduated, while his classmates are putting on their suits and hoping to get into some Wall Street firms and et cetera, he was bound to go south. And he first went to Atlanta, and then he eventually ended up in Alabama. And eventually formed the EGI, Equal Justice Initiative. And so when he was starting out, and he was, I don't know how many hours a week he was working, because it was basically he and another person running all over from Georgia to Alabama and back and to Florida, and trying to get people off. And he was almost like I got the sense that he was like so passionate, he was almost driven to achieve justice for many of these people. And he's been doing it ever since. He started in his 20s. Oh, this Saturday will be his birthday, 2 days from now, and he'll be 61 years old. And he continues to do it. And he's just a marvelous individual.
And I think it also illustrates that we do need reform, but we need to put more emphasis into mental health, because What was so interesting about the book is he had that story of Walter. The structure was having Walter throughout the book, but then he brought in so many extra stories about different people who were in prison for various reasons, different ages. So it's not just the one case. It was a whole string of them.
Yeah, for example, there's a story of a young woman called Trina. Try it again. A girl called Trina Garrett, and she's 13 years old. Remember when we were 13? We're not grown up. We are kids. And remember, for the women here and the men, how interacting with boyfriends and girlfriends were an important part of our life. So Trina, I'm sorry, she's 14, not 13, and her 16-year-old friend sneak over to a boy's house, and they want to visit this boy. And the house is dark, and they sneak in, and they can't see where they're going, so they're lighting matches. Something that I could understand, you know. Well, the house becomes on fire, and 2 boys in that house die. She was sentenced to second-degree murder as a 14-year-old, and her sentence for second degree. This is life with no parole. When Bryan Stevenson ran into her, that 14-year-old has become, I think, about a 50-year-old. And he knew instantly she was mentally challenged after spending also that many years. So these are the stories that he tells. And I kept thinking the stuff I did when I was 14 years old. And I never would have guessed of ending up in prison for life. You know, our local sheriff in town, I listened to one of her talks, and our local sheriff said she used to be head of the prison. She said, I and everyone here are just one bad decision from being in that jail. And that struck me. One bad decision away.
What Bryan said during the book, I'm sure he said it other times, is that what he would tell the people he met is we are more than our worst decision. We are more than the lie. We are more than the matches. And he's able to look at the individuals and see that more than and convince them that they are more than that bad decision.
Yeah, that quote really struck me. When you think of, we are all human beings. There are things that we've done we're not proud of. And what Bryan is telling us is we are all more than the worst thing we have done. We are more than that.
But there's a bigger component here, and that's the racism that's systemic in this country. We read the book, The Color of Law, and those were people who couldn't even get proper housing because of their race. And certainly in this situation, a lot of these people are being put into prison because of their color. Look at him, Bryan himself sitting in his car on the street listening to music. Who hasn't done that?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
And then the police come in and rough him up. So not only is it that we're better than our worst or our one mistake or whatever the quote was, but it's a systemic racism that we have here. So how do we cope with that?
Laura, I see a number of components when I look at the justice system.
Yeah.
For this, I've handled a couple of first-degree homicides too.
Well,
But you're right about the racism. But another component is the public defender system. We're fortunate in Wisconsin, we've got a pretty good one. Down in the South, when Hurricane Andrew went through and all that, and there was disruption and all the whatever, the public defender system there is atrocious. It's just terrible. If a person got an attorney, they'd have a different attorney for the next hearing and a different one for the hearing after that. It's like they never had the same attorney. And if the color of your skin makes a difference, your economic status makes a difference. And you put on top of that the idea that eyewitness testimony is the worst evidence in the justice system, the very worst. People get it wrong, even though they're not lying. What happens with eyewitness testimony is you take that memory of whatever you saw and you file it away in your file system in your brain. You pull it out. The more times you pull it out, the more times that item, that memory is affected by your present sense. Like if it was cold that day, when you pull it out a week later and it's warm outside, you inject warmness into that memory. Every time you pull it out, the more times you pull it out, the more times the police talk to you, the more like a witness, an eyewitness, the more your testimony gets shaded and you don't even realize it. So if it takes a year or two to get to court, you've got a witness that would pass a lie detector test, but they're telling you an absolute untruth, not untruth, but I mean, didn't happen that way. So people get convicted of eyewitness. And if you have some kind of prejudice against somebody because of their color or because they're a young kid, like in 12 Angry Men, that was a huge prejudice. There's a young kid in that one. In color, there's, well, whatever. But anyway, there's big injustice in there. And again, in Wisconsin, we're very fortunate. We don't have a death penalty. The reason why we don't have a death penalty, I maybe you know, maybe you don't know, there's a botched, I think it was hanging in Kenosha. And it was just horrible. I had a person, took them forever to die. And it was such an outrageous thing in Wisconsin. We did away with the death penalty. We had it at one point.
Steve, that was in the 1800s, right?
Yes, it was.
1850s or 60s, something like that?
It's a long time. There's a guy by the name of McCaffrey, I think. 1853.
Okay.
It was 1853, the death penalty. The only execution carried out was that of a immigrant farmer,
There.
August 21st,
Okay.
51.
Now okay, already.
And it was
Bye-bye.
for drowning his wife in the backyard cistern. I read a book, I think it was by Percy Foreman. He talked about it representing hundreds of people that committed murders, supposedly. And he got them all off. By getting them off, he meant they didn't get the death penalty. They might have got life in prison. He only defended one person who got the death penalty in the end. And that was for a guy for killing his wife, which, see, if you remove that idea of somebody close to you that they're dead now,
Yeah.
that particular defendant isn't probably very dangerous anymore because that element isn't in their life anymore. And that's another issue that goes on too. Why do you put together, there's certain crimes that you should, if you're gonna have a death penalty, it should be imposed on, but a familial one, maybe not. Okay, I'm done with that.
Well, I
It's
see my
very interesting.
sister has joined us as an unknown
Oh.
host.
Hi,
Hello,
John.
Meryl. Hello.
Finally.
Finally. Hello. Steve, I have a
Yes.
question for you.
Oh,
What were, oh,
You've been in practice for a lot of years, and you've done everything from murder murders to drunk drivers to et cetera, et cetera.
A cow case. I had a cow case. My dad and my brother and Ralph Erlash had cow cases. So when I came in, I had to have a cow case.
You had a cow case.
Okay.
No, really. Only in Wisconsin.
Well, quickly tell us about the cow case. You throw the bait out, Steve. Tell us.
There's a statute that says a cow has the right of way if they're tended by a farmer. So if there's a cow that on a country road that started across the road, the cow has the right of way if there's a farmer watching them. But if there's no farmer watching them, they don't, and there's an accident. I think that's a long time ago, but anyway, that's my understanding of what it was. But you're going to ask something more serious, I think.
Yeah. So you've been in practice for a long time. I'm
50
sure
years next year.
as a defense
Wow.
attorney, correct?
Yes. The first day I practiced, I had a hearing. I didn't know I was going to have it. In 2 hours, I had to be in court for meeting with my person, the mental commitment, and they didn't commit the person because I was quick on my feet.
Ah.
And in fact, I asked the person a question, or the person was asked a question and they gave the wrong answer. That's why they got off.
Interesting.
Hmm.
Here's my question, Steve. I imagine over the course of your career, you have run across situations where you really believe the person is innocent and yet is convicted or found guilty. How do you deal with that? That's my question.
Those are the tough ones. You try not to handle people that are close to you and all that, so that will bear with you later on, you know. I agree with that. It's very hard to deal with. And I've been in that situation where, in one of my murder cases, I guess I felt that way too. But it isn't so much if they're guilty or not. It's what's the penalty, even if they're found guilty.
Yeah, that's part of it too. Yeah.
Does the penalty, does it fit? And I figure my job as a defense attorney, public defender, court appointed or whatever, private, is to make sure that if they're convicted, the penalty's right. So I don't ask people, are you guilty? I've seen some movies where they kind of did that, but that's not the question I'm looking at whether they're found guilty or not. The jury determines the guilt, not the judge normally. And the judge will do the sentencing normally in this state. And it's very hard. It's very hard when you really feel the person, when you work your heart out and you feel the person's shouldn't be convicted by the jury and they come back guilty.
Yeah.
And the DA's doing some tricks on you too, and they hide stuff, and that's been done.
Speaking of judges, in the case with Walter McMillan, the jury, after 1.5 days, came in with a guilty verdict, but they recommended life imprisonment without parole. There was a judge override, and the judge changed that life imprisonment to death by the electric chair. Now, Bryan Stevenson talked about this, and I thought about this too. Judges, at least down in Alabama, are elected. They're not appointed like a federal judge. And, thank you.
Some water.
I think there are certain places where being tough on crime gets you elected. And therefore, I think there is a incentive. It might be at the conscious level or the subconscious level for judges in general, the judges in particular, in Walter McMillan's case, to be really tough on crime and override the jury recommendation. And so I guess I react to that very negatively, but I wonder, and Steve, maybe you can help us out here. How common is that for a judge to override a jury's recommendation.
It isn't either way it works. But normally I would say if the judge is going to override, he normally would think of overriding and judge, what they call it JNOV, judgment notwithstanding the verdict. In other words, if the jury comes in, the judge can change the verdict, but normally it's not to increase the penalty or anything.
It's to decrease it.
It's to decrease it. And in fact, if they come in with guilty on a murder case, I think in some instances, the judge can say, I'm going to ignore that verdict because, and then they come up with certain reasons why certain evidence was wrong or tainted or whatever. But that's, I've never heard of it actually, but you said the proposal, it's, and I think you're absolutely right. The politics of it is terrible.
Yeah.
And our judges are elected every 6 years, or the Supreme Court 10 years. I think the appellate court 10 years. But the local courts are the only ones that really work over trials.
Interesting. In just a few minutes, we're going to look at a really well done interview with Bryan Stevenson. To lead into that interview, though, I'm going to hit you with 3 quotes that jumped out at me in the book. Bryan writes, "We will ultimately not be judged by our technology. We won't be judged by our design. We won't be judged by our intellect and reason. Ultimately, you judge the character of a society by how they treat the poor, the condemned, the incarcerated. The opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. The question is, do we have the right to kill?" He's talking about the establishment. Finally, and we did this one before, every person in our society is more than the worst thing they've ever done. That's, Laura, if you could
Show them.
pull up
Interview.
the interview.
Yeah, here we go.
Your book is Just Mercy, a story of justice and redemption for Saul. Welcome. Thank you. Glad to be here. And you are also the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, the professor at the New York University School of Law. It's great to hear about how you first began this journey of thinking about justice in America. Yeah. Well, I actually grew up in a poor rural community where the schools were still segregated when I started my education. So I started my education in a colored school, and lawyers came into the community and made them open up the public schools for Black children. And I didn't appreciate it then, but it kind of planted this idea that lawyers were people who had power to change things, even though I never really thought much about being a lawyer. When I graduated from college with a degree in philosophy, I realized nobody was going to pay me to philosophize. And so I started looking around for ways to kind of find meaningful ways to spend time, and ended up in law school like a lot of people. But I have to say, I really didn't like it. I was there to kind of focus on racial issues and poverty and justice. And it didn't sound like anybody was talking about race or poverty and justice. And it was really only in the middle of my law school career that I had an opportunity to take an intern that sent me to the Deep South, where I met people on death row. And these were folks literally dying for legal assistance, condemned people who had no money, who had no lawyers, whose cases really reflected some really troubling truths about the American criminal justice system. I think we have a system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. It's a system that presumes the guilt of Black and brown people. It's a system that's been compromised by politics and that tolerates a lot of unreliability. And the idea that these people were going to be killed when those kinds of questions were so resonant really jarred me. And I immediately knew that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to stand with condemned people who were facing execution in a system I thought was unjust, unfair, and terribly unreliable. You started at the center of your story, which leads into a lot of conversation, obviously, about justice and racial equality in the United States. Walter McMillan. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about who he is. Yeah. So Mr. McMillan was an African American man in Monroeville, Alabama, who was accused of committing a murder in the 1980s. It was a terrible crime that took place in downtown Monroeville when a young white woman was murdered at a dry cleaning store, and the police couldn't solve the crime. 6 months later, there's a lot of pressure on them to solve it, and they couldn't. And we believe they targeted Mr. McMillan not because he had a prior crime history, had never been in trouble before, but we believe they targeted him because he was an African American man having an affair with a young white woman. And even though at the time of the crime, he was with his family and about 20 other people raising money for his sister's church 11 miles away, they persisted in prosecuting him over this murder he clearly didn't commit. It was a case filled with ironies. When I met him, it was clear that he was innocent. It was clear that people were just ignoring all of this evidence. But it was also clear that this community was very disconnected. This community, Monroeville, Alabama, is actually where Harper Lee grew up and wrote the very beloved American novel, To Kill a Mockingbird. If you go to Monroeville, you see evidence of that everywhere. They love that story. They put on plays about it each year. All the streets are named after characters. In the book, there's a Boo Radley deli. You can get an Atticus milkshake. I mean, they just love the story. And yet, we're completely indifferent to the plight of this innocent black man facing execution. They put him on death row for 15 months before the trial, almost to create an identity for him that he is super dangerous. The trial lasted a day and a half. The jury convicted him of murder. The judge, whose name was Robert E. Lee Key, overrode the jury's verdict of life and imposed the death penalty. In our state, about 25% of the people on death row got life verdicts from juries that our elected judges can override. And then they sent him back to death row. And that really, just all of that, really challenged me when I met him. There was a despair in the poor and minority community that was also deeply troubling to me because people were with him when the crime took place and they knew he was innocent. Right? They felt his conviction in a very personal way. They could say, Mr. Stevenson, it would have been so much better if he'd been out in the woods hunting by himself when the crime took place, because at least then we could entertain the possibility that he might be guilty. But because we were there with him, we feel like we've been convicted too. We feel like we've been sentenced to death too. And the hopelessness was tangible. And so working on that case for me was not just working to free an innocent man, but it was also working to change a narrative that emerged in that community. That even though we talk about justice, even though we talk about race, we talk about all these things, we don't do anything that has actually made it any safer for poor and people of color. One of the most compelling elements of that story for me, the Walter McMillan story, is that you learn about this man, his life, and you actually learn his story. And that requires a level of empathy to understand a person's story, a person's background, a person's history, and take that into consideration when we think about justice. Yeah. What do you think in terms of the United States and our sense of empathy and our sense of justice? What's happened to that over the course of the last century? Yeah, no, I think it's really critical. I don't think you can effectively advocate for people you do not understand. And it's when we get closer to people that we really understand who they are and what their lives are about. And I don't think that our country has done a good job of owning up to the ways in which it has created anguish and pain and suffering and marginality. With a kind of thoughtful engagement about the people, right? You know, I think it's because we have developed some really bad habits dating back to the time of slavery. I mean, you know, for me, the great evil of American slavery was not involuntary servitude. It was the narrative of racial difference that we created. We've always wanted to feel good about who we are. We've always wanted to be proud. And we'll deny certain truths if it complicates our feeling of being good or being proud. And, you know, the great difference between America's slavery and the rest of the world, most countries had slavery during a period of their history, but they were mostly societies with slaves. We became a slave society. We wanted slave owners to feel good about the fact that they were owning other human beings. So we created this narrative that Black people were different, not fully human, not as smart as, not as hardworking as. And that narrative of racial difference, that ideology of white supremacy, was to me the great evil of American slavery. And we did it so that people could feel Christian and moral and just, meanwhile they owned other human beings. But it's why I don't believe that slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. And we've never confronted that narrative. And so we had decades of lynching, terrorism. We had segregation, and even the civil rights movement has become too celebratory. We don't talk about the resistance. And that's left us vulnerable to cases like Walter McMillan, where we presume the dangerousness and guilt of Black and brown people. And you see it today and with the shootings of these unarmed men by police officers. You see it when people of color feel threatened and menaced and harassed. You see it in the way our system functions. We've had 152 people exonerated, that is proved innocent after being sentenced to death. And almost all of them are poor. They're disproportionately Black and brown. And it's because we apply this presumption of dangerousness and guilt to Black and brown people. And that's the challenge I think we face in this country. Unlike other societies, we've never made truth telling about our mistakes a priority. We didn't have truth and reconciliation after the civil rights movement. We haven't done what Germany is doing around the Holocaust. If you go to Germany, you see markers and monuments everywhere, marking the spaces where Jewish families were abducted and taken to the concentration camps. And they want you to go to the camps and reflect soberly on the history of the Holocaust. We want the opposite. We don't like talking about race. We don't like talking about slavery. We don't like talking about lynching, segregation, or the exploitation of Native people. And because of that, we remain vulnerable in our criminal justice system to replicating these dynamics of racial bias and discrimination against the poor and abusing power that have too often corrupted the way our society functions. And so I think working in the criminal justice system gives you an opportunity to push against that resistance, the arrogance of never having to say, I'm sorry, the consciousness that comes when you're kind of reflecting on the ways you failed. And that was the great challenge of the McMillan case, was getting the community to recognize that they had made a mistake, that they were wrong, getting past the arrogance and the ego and the resistance to acknowledging the fallibility of the system that is very, very compromised. I think there's a lot of people that think, well, come on, that was, the 1960s or that was the 1860s, but the point is, like, they think that that's enough time for everyone to have gotten over it. Your answer to somebody who thinks that, it's time to look forward, not backwards. Well, I think we never dealt with what we were dealing with in the 1860s. We never talked honestly about slavery. We've never dealt with lynching. We've never dealt with the real ugliness. When we talk about civil rights in this country, we tend to be very celebratory. We talk about the heroic acts of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. But the real story of the civil rights era was the resistance of millions of people who did not want racial integration. And we haven't talked about that. And so the reason why it's not in the distant past is because it's still this big open wound that we have failed to treat. And it manifests itself day in and day out. People are really upset in this country right now about the plight of these young men who are being shot by police. We're upset. The Bureau of Justice now projects that 1 in 3 Black male babies is expected to go to jail or prison during his lifetime. That's not all about their mistakes. It's also about the way in which we manage these problems. And we say in this country that saying I'm a proud American is a necessary precondition to everything. And we haven't complicated that narrative in the ways I think we have to. We come to the Deep South, we love to celebrate mid-19th century history. We talk about the Confederacy like it was the grand, glorious era. Jefferson Davis's birthday is a state holiday in Alabama. Confederate Memorial Day is a state holiday, and we don't even have Martin Luther King Day. We have Martin Luther King / Robert E. Lee Day. And so that false notion of pride is actually a barrier to confronting some of these challenges, and they live with us. They're not invisible. They are all around us. I've been practicing law for 30 years. I've argued 5 cases at the Supreme Court. I have my so-called degree. It's not a so-called degree. I have a degree. It's a real one. It's a real degree from Harvard Law School. And yet, I was sitting in a courtroom just 2 years ago, getting ready to do a hearing. I was at defense counsel's table with my suit and tie on, and the judge walked out. And he saw me sitting there, and he said, hey, you get back out there in the hallway, and you wait until your lawyer gets here. I don't want any defendant sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And I stood up and said, I'm sorry, Your Honor. My name is Bryan Stevenson. I am the lawyer. And the judge started laughing, and the prosecutor started laughing, and I made myself laugh because I didn't want to disadvantage my client. But afterward, I was thinking, what is it about this place that when a judge sees a middle-aged Black man in a suit and tie at counsel table, it doesn't occur to him, that's the lawyer. And whatever it is, do I think it's going to disadvantage defendants of color when they're being sentenced? Yes. Do I think it's going to influence the way that judge hears the testimony of Black and minority witnesses? Yes. Do I think it's going to shape the way he values the victimization of people of color? Yes. And that kind of bias is everywhere. And we have been corrupted, in my judgment, by our failure, our silence in confronting our history of racial inequality. And many of the people I write about in the book are the victims of that silence. They're the victims of our failure to show some humility, to acknowledge our inability to get past our biases. I don't think the death penalty in America is an issue that's shaped by whether people, that you can answer by asking the question, do people deserve to die for the crimes they've committed? I think you have to ask the question, do we deserve to kill? And where you have a system that has failed to do better in eliminating racial bias, eliminating bias against the poor, eliminating political effects, eliminating abuse of power, we don't deserve to kill. And in many ways, I wrote this book because I'm persuaded that if people saw what I see on a regular basis, they would demand change. They would want change. They would not support what goes on in the name of justice. So, can you change minds, or are you banging the drum for the next generation that's now formulating opinions? And we seem so intractable in some of our opinions at this point. Are you writing this book for the converted and their children and the next generation of children, or you're trying to change people's minds? No, I really want to change people's minds. I mean, we're doing a lot of work now that's kind of designed to engage people in conversation. I write about people who initially, when they confront me, are pretty hostile, who carry that narrative of racial difference in the way that they interact with me. But through our time together, I see real change, real progress. I think you have to be hopeful about what you can do. I'm not interested in talking to people who are already where I think they need to be on these issues. I want to talk to people who aren't there. And we've had some success with that in our casework, in our litigation, in our advocacy, but not nearly as much. I think things are intractable only because we haven't struggled very much to shake them up. I mean, we're a society that we talk in the margins a little bit about these issues, but we haven't really engaged in a meaningful way. We've got a project where we're trying to put markers and monuments at all the slave trading spaces in America. I want to put markers and monuments at all the lynching sites in this country. And that will be challenging, and it will create a little controversy, but I think that's a healthy start to a conversation we need to have. And so for me, yeah, it's a time of real challenge, but a time of great opportunity. I think we're in a place where if we're diligent, we can really create a new generation that gets beyond some of these issues. Well, this book is a great start as well. Just Mercy. Bryan Stevenson, thanks so much for joining us here today. It's a wonderful book. Thank you very much. Great to meet you. Yeah, you too.
Okay, I muted everyone because of the video, but you can go ahead and unmute yourselves if you'd like to comment. Does everyone know how to do that?
Yeah, it's on mine is bottom left.
Yeah.
On an iPad, it's top right. So, yeah,
There.
can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, all right. What I was going to mention before, John, with Bryan Stevenson, just last week I rented his movie, Just Mercy.
Yeah.
Have you guys seen it yet?
I've seen it. Yeah.
Yeah, it was excellent.
Marilyn, you've been working, through your church on criminal justice, etc. Why don't you, and then we'll tell us about some of the things you've been doing. Well,
I'm on that committee called Church and Society. And just recently, and meanwhile, over the last few years, we would have some type, like a book drive, and I have met and talked to many times the chaplain at Madison Jail, at the Madison Jail.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, there is a group and it's called Friends of the Madison Area Jail Ministry. So I am a member of that. And so and I've only been on this less than a month now, but our chairman of that committee introduced himself, and he was incarcerated for 3 years on a crime that he did not commit. And this happened in Milwaukee. And he was incarcerated because of fraud, supposedly of fraud.
Yeah.
And he sat in jail for 3 years, and they finally found the guy who did do this fraud. So I thought that was real interesting too. And so you can imagine his passion about
Yeah, I
jail
can.
ministry and things like that.
To have 3 years
So,
of your
and-
life taken away.
Oh yeah, 3 years. So, but anyway, some other things we just, right now we're doing a, pardon?
You did the book drive.
Yeah, and we've done, that's John's. We're doing a coat drive now, and things that you would never think of. Because so often people are incarcerated in the summertime, men and women. And now they get out in the winter and they have nothing to wear because they just went in probably with no coat or just a light jacket. So anyway, we've had this coat drive for the coats and hats and mittens and all warm clothing. So we've done that. We've had a book drive and the chaplain will suggest different books that he's looking for. In fact, our church just gave $500 to the chaplain there for purchasing all these special books that he wanted. And one being on addictions and just, helping prisoners dealing with things like that. So it's been interesting. It really has.
Yeah.
So I'm a Friends of Madison Area Jail Ministry. And so then I'm a liaison, so I have to write new articles for the newsletter and for the bulletin and things like that. So
Okay.
that's it.
Thank you. Thank you. You know what Bryan Stevenson was talking about beyond the Just Mercy book is institutionalized racism. That's what his whole focus was. And I think it's all around us.
Oh, sure.
It's all, I've told this story to some, but I'll tell it again. And as a white man and a father, there's my son Andy, I've never had the need to ask him or to teach him how to respond to a police officer if he stopped for speeding or in an automobile. About the 10 to 2 hands on the wheel, what have you. Never had that need. I was on a board with a black fellow, and he lived in Green Bay and commuted to Appleton to work. Now I've done that drive many times, Appleton to Green Bay. I've never been pulled over by a police officer. When I was on the board with him, he had talked about being pulled over for the 20th time. The 20th. Now this is a professional looking guy. He works a professional job.
Right.
And of course, what would happen, there would be a crime in Green Bay, and he'd be driving from Green Bay to Appleton, and surprise, surprise, he'd be pulled over because the person who committed the crime was on the run, was a black person. So you want to talk about profiling. But Ron, his name is Ron, is also the person who told me about teaching his sons how to respond to a police officer if you're stopped for speeding and the like. To save your life, he made the point. And of course, now we see some stories, don't we, on the news about people getting shot in the back and et cetera, et cetera. And some of those people are not nice people. But then the question is, do they deserve to die? That's the larger question. As
know,
Bryan Stevenson said, when we take capital punishment, use it, do we have the right to kill someone else?
Mhm.
Years ago, I was approached by a group
like our
wanting me to.
grandchildren. Are you? Oh,
Go on, Linda.
I had somebody wanting me to sign a petition against the death sentence, and it was the Ted Bundy case. And I couldn't. I just felt there's a few people that are just so evil that we don't need them around. But in general, I'm not for it. But in that case, I was.
Yeah. Certainly it's across our country, people have all different reactions to the death penalty.
John,
Yeah.
not a death penalty thing, but I had an occasion where this gets right into it about whether a person deserves some serious penalty or not. I had occasion to be working with somebody who was also being ministered to by a minister all through the situation, long situation
Mhm.
and at one point I was talking with the minister about, was he going to see the person in prison if he was convicted? And the minister didn't know.
Ah,
He thought if 12 people convicted a person of a heinous crime, that would give him pause to reflect on whether he should continue ministering to the person he knows pretty well. That's real hard. I knew what my job was as an attorney.
yeah.
Minister knew what their job was. Not at all.
Mhm.
Interesting point, Steve.
It's a true story. I had to counsel the minister on maybe he did have a duty to see the person. It didn't matter what 12 people thought. That shouldn't change his thinking. What the crowd thinks, that shouldn't make any difference.
That should not make any difference. I like that, what the crowd thinks. 12 people. Interesting point, Steve.
Well, and the statistics show a lot of people, I mean, they make a lot of mistakes from what I've read.
Well, of course, it has to do with eyewitness testimony.
Right.
It has to do with you pulling this memory out and changing it. So when you get on the stand, you tell a convincing story because you believe it, but it isn't true.
So this whole thing with DNA these days, where they're identifying criminals from cold case files and things, it's a little questionable, but it's actually it's a proof beyond memory, right?
If it's used correctly.
Laura, do you know how many people the Innocence Project has gotten off of death row or life imprisonment?
Yeah,
It's
I
a
don't
huge
have the
number.
exact, I don't have any numbers.
And
If
they
anyone's
mostly been using
interested,
DNA.
the website, the website that they have up for this Equal Justice Initiative is very informative. You let me quickly show you what that looks like.
Yeah, put it up there, Laura. Yeah.
I think it's right here. This is it. And there you saw Walter was featured, but they also have that young boy who was 14 in here. His name was George Stinney, not guilty of anything, just a victim. And they have a lot of stories here about what's going on today. The news section is very interesting. So I recommend that if anyone's interested in this subject at all,
There's
this is a place to
EJI,
go to find out more about it and what they're doing. I thought that was so interesting that they're trying to put up markers in various places in the country as memorials to get people
where the
talking.
lynchings occurred, right?
Yeah.
They are doing that, I believe. No, they're doing that in Germany.
In England too.
in England, where not lynchings, but where in the Holocaust, where people were taken from. I believe that.
There was a program on the British TV called Black and British and traced the history of slavery and England's part in it. So the gentleman who did that program in some groups were going around putting markers in various places for incidents in British history. So other people are noting it, as Bryan Stevenson mentioned in the video.
Okay.
At least as far as the younger people go, I think the court system in Door County at least has changed and gotten better. I think both of our judges and the DA and the sheriff knows that kids that are under 25, especially boys, do really stupid things. Their brain isn't developed. It's a biological thing, it's a psychological thing, and that they change. They do grow up after about age 25. And I think the court systems in fashioning sentencings and remedies is, at least in Door County, is definitely recognizing that, and that's a definite step forward.
That's encouraging and very good news, Steve.
Yeah, I'm glad. to
Are
hear
there any countries that look at prisons as more of a form of rehabilitation rather than punishment?
Yeah, the Danish countries, for sure. I'm not an expert in this field, but very, very much so. And their penalties are so much lower than ours for any type of crime. But I can remember back in the 60s and 70s where there was this move towards rehabilitation. Well, it never really quite happened. And where I knew it really stopped is, let me talk about my experience at the university. We used to have at the university a bunch of us professors, I never did, but I worked with them, going into the Green Bay Correctional Institute, into the prison, and putting on college classes for prisoners. And the people I talked to who did that said, number one, those prisoners were truly a captive audience and were their best students because they had a lot of time to read and prepare for class and what have you. Well, that all came to an end. There, basically, these prisoners were on grants to pay for the courses they were taking, and that money was taken away from them. And that was the end of their college education. And it was, when I talked to the people who were involved, it was such a successful program. All came to a screeching halt to get tough on prisoners. That's not that long ago. This happened, really within the last 15 years or 20. I've been retired for here a while. That's right. Any other comments, questions?
Did they ever solve the crime?
No.
On who murdered the girl?
Nope. The murderer still is out there. One of the things that happened is Bryan Stevenson suspected someone who kept calling his office, asking questions, but never, there was no evidence to go after that person. But Bryan Stevenson was giving I think a talk in a church, and he was asked or prepared to talk about what Johnny D. or Walter McMillan taught him. And I would like to use our last few minutes here to read some of it. I'm on page 313 of the book. Walter made me understand why we have to reform a system of criminal justice that continues to treat people better if they are rich and guilty than if they are poor and innocent. A system that denies the poor the legal help they need, that makes wealth and status more important than culpability, must be changed. Walter taught me that fear and anger are a threat to justice. They can infect a community, a state, or a nation and make us blind, irrational, and dangerous. Walter's case taught me that the death penalty is not about whether people deserve to die for the crimes they commit. The real question of capital punishment in this country is, do we deserve to kill? Secondly, it's sort of a humorous part of the book. When Rosa Parks was alive, once in a while, Bryan would get invited to a discussion with Rosa Parks and a couple of her lady friends. And he would be invited to listen, not to talk. So he saw it as a great honor to listen to Rosa Parks and her lady friends. So he did this a number of times. One, where he's describing a place or a time when they're having the discussion, and Rosa Parks turns to Bryan and says, "Well, what do you do about this equal justice initiative? What's that all about?" And this, it's about 5 sentences. It sort of captures what Bryan Stevenson has dedicated his entire life to for the last 30-some years. Here we go. We are trying to stop the death penalty. We're trying to do something about prison conditions and excessive punishment. We want to free people who have been wrongfully committed. We want to end unfair sentences in criminal cases and stop racial bias in criminal justice. We're trying to help the poor and do something about indigent defense and the fact that people don't get the legal help they need. We're trying to help people who are actually mentally ill. We are trying to stop them from putting children in adult jails and prisons. We're trying to do something about poverty and the hopelessness that dominates poor communities. We want to see more diversity in decision-making in the justice system. We're trying to educate people about racial history and the need for racial justice. We're trying to confront abuse of power by police and prosecutors. Miss Parks leaned back smiling. She says, "Oh, honey, that's all going to make you tired, tired, tired." But then another lady in the discussion says to Bryan, that's why you've got to be brave, brave, brave. And for me, Bryan Stevenson is brave, brave, brave. For me, it's truly an inspiration. I don't know when he sleeps. He's also a professor up in New York University.
Yeah.
So you throw that on top of all this. He also started, you can go online and you can see outdoor, I'll call it an outdoor museum dedicated to racial justice and sculptures of, it's very powerful. I don't know. He's just an amazing fellow. So I'm glad, Laura, that you recommended this book to me. It was we were trying to think of what we'd do for a book discussion, and Laura said let's go with this one. And great book. So Louis, question for you before we go.
Sure.
You hadn't read the book yet, but you've been reading all about it, right? All different takes on the book, right?
Yes.
What was just sort of putting you on the spot here, but so the people who were talking about this book, what was sort of the general message that they were communicating, or the one that you picked up on?
Oh, it was all over the place, John. It's kind of like, I think it's in the concept of what we've been talking about here. One of them was that capital punishment is defensible for those who have the capital, kind of a thing. That was one of the issues that came through on it. And then another one were these issues that you were just talking about, that we are really greater than the worst thing that we've done. And I think that's something that comes through pretty strongly about that. And it seems to be an answer where this capital punishment comes about, is that we're greater than the worst thing we've done. We're all part of this whole thing together. And do we really have that that right or that obligation to kill? I think that's the concept that comes about. And it just seems to be that it's one of the evils that we're dealing with, is how this comes about. I don't know, it's kind of complicated as far as the whole issue is, but it seems to be the thread that runs through all of this. We just have to be greater than the worst. I don't know if that said anything or not.
I think it's worth watching the movie also, but the movie does focus on the one story of Walter. But if you read the book, he brings in so many different stories that it makes you see that it's not just one situation. It's the whole system.
It's the theme of that theme that runs through
So
it.
it's worth reading the book.
Young people, the poor, the underrepresented, the marginalized.
Yeah, and not only underrepresented, but I think we deal with that. That I think is what's kind of behind these movements for the defunding the police department, for instance. It's not to, it's to work with the help for that, the mental, you've mentioned about the mental assistance that needs to be given, and the system needs to get into that type of an approach on it. And to me, one of the things to start that is to look at that whole punishment system. Is it a punishment or is it a rehabilitation? And to take that whole try with it. Is it a when we say, do we have the right to kill? I think it's the same thing about having the right to take a person's whole physical life away from them for the rest of their living years.
Yeah.
It's complicated. It's a complicated issue. But it just seems to be necessary to deal with all of that somehow. It's something that's totally missing in the system.
Has anybody
Sandy.
seen the ABC series For Life? It's based on a true story about a man who was wrongfully committed on death row and works with people. He gets a lawyer degree and defends himself, but in the process or during that time, he also represents lots of his fellow inmates, but kind of along those same lines, but from the inside out, and not always using high principled things, because he's dealing with inmates.
Yeah, yeah.
But very interesting.
I think these issues that Steve raised about ministering to the person based upon the decision of 12 people is it gets at the heart of what this is all about too. It's kind of a disturbing thought that's out there, that this is where we are as a group, as a society, and that we're part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we help change that?
I think the new Jim Crow law, the mass incarceration, is a book that's pointed out so many of these injustices as well.
Well, I think we have come to a close here.
We could go a long time with this kind of a discussion, I guess. So
yeah,
but I think you're right. It's time to close.
yeah, we're at 3:30, and in spring we'll be doing another one. One of these days we'll be able to get together face to face, but in the meantime we do Zoom. But I'd like to thank everyone for being part of this, and for those who haven't read Just Mercy, you got to read it. This is a powerful book. And also for those of you who haven't seen the movie, you will really like the movie. And the guy who plays Walter, you will recognize him instantly, but he does a great job. And Michael B. Jordan, who plays Bryan, does a great job also. And finally, Laura has it on the webpage for this discussion. You can click right on TED Talks, and you'll see Bryan give a 20-some minute, very moving talk about this book, but also racial injustice.
I do want to quickly point out as we're ending that it's November, and the day after Thanksgiving, we're going to be handing out the Door County Read books. So be sure to call and get a copy for those who are in the area anyway. The title is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, and it's about a pandemic.
Oh, how appropriate, huh?
But it's a brilliant book. We chose that book before this pandemic hit, and I think you'll enjoy it. There's a lot of the arts involved in it. So we have some good programs planned. So look for that book right after Thanksgiving.
Okay. Sounds good.
Thank you.
Well, everyone have a good winter.
Thank you.
And see you in spring.
Who compiled that list of all the books that you looked at?
Over the years?
Yeah, over the years.
Well, Nancy Emery left a notebook of things that were done before my time. And I went through there and pulled them out of that. And then I've kept a list since I've been in charge of it.
Well, that's an interesting list, I guess. So that's.
Yeah, what Louis is talking about is this book discussion started 20 years ago. And Louis is one of the almost a founding father of this. He goes he could go back that far. It's hard to believe this is our 37th book we have done.
Unless I missed something.
Yeah, I think probably that. Oh, okay. I think we're that number's pretty close, Laura.
Let me show everyone where to find it if they're interested.
Yeah.
Since I know how to share my screen here.
Yeah, just learned how to do that.
Let's see. So if you go to doorcountylibrary.org calendar, you'll see the programs, and this is where you would go to log in on Zoom. And I put this list at the very bottom here. There's a couple of good, we're going to show one of these today, but here's the list. Since 2000.
Wow.
So you can see. And here's the newest one right here. So that's how you find it.
Yeah, it's amazing.